The war that America entered in late 1941 was one it had not planned to fight on distant jungled islands. Its armies still trained with outdated equipment, and its industry was only beginning the shift from peacetime production to the scale demanded by global conflict. When the question of tanks reached Washington and Detroit, the answer was neither elegant nor revolutionary. It was pragmatic. Engineers were asked for a machine that could be built fast, shipped easily, and fixed anywhere. The result would become the M4 Sherman. At first glance, the Sherman was unremarkable. Its armor was moderate, not heavy enough to withstand the largest anti-tank guns of Europe. Its 75mm gun was competent but unspectacular, a weapon designed to handle most infantry positions and medium vehicles, but not intended to duel heavily armored foes. Yet behind the plain silhouette lay a set of decisions that reflected America's strategic imagination. The U.S. Army did not expect to meet fleets of enemy tanks in the Pacific. It expected jungles, rough roads, and long supply lines. A tank that could be built by the tens of thousands and kept running with basic tools mattered more than one. Capable of single duels of prestige, factories that had once stamped automobile frames began cutting armored plate. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors turned peacetime assembly lines into tank plants. The Sherman was built with a kind of industrial humility. Wide tracks for soft ground, an engine borrowed from aircraft or commercial trucks, standardized parts that could be swapped between units. Where other nations built bespoke armored beasts, the United States chose something closer to a working tractor clad in steel. A machine that could be trusted to start, move, and keep moving. By 1942, the first production, Shermans rolled off lines in numbers that startled allies and adversaries alike. Britain received them early under Lend-Lease and sent back mixed reports. The tank was roomy, reliable, and mechanically simple, but thinly protected, and armed with what many called an average gun. American officers listened, but stayed the course. They knew the real strength lay not in a single duel, but in fleets. A single Sherman was modest, a battalion was formidable, and an endless pipeline of spares and replacements meant broken machines could be replaced faster than enemies could destroy them. When Japan looked across the Pacific, it saw little reason to fear American armor. Japanese doctrine had grown from years of fighting in China, where light, maneuverable tanks supported infantry and artillery did the heavy destruction. Island defenses relied on concrete bunkers, tunnels, and fields of fire for artillery and machine guns. Heavy steel beasts seemed unnecessary in terrain where a man with explosives could block a road, and coral reefs could break landing craft. Reports from China and early fighting in the Philippines reinforced this comfort. Japanese crews nicknamed their own vehicles thin-skinned but agile, and saw no urgent need for heavier designs. Against that backdrop, the Sherman's arrival seemed almost comical, tall, gasoline-powered, and carrying a gun that on paper looked ordinary. Yet what Japanese intelligence did not fully grasp in 1941 and 1942 was the logic of scale that had built the tank. The United States was preparing not a few specialized regiments, but an entire ocean-spanning network able to feed and fuel mechanical war. Liberty ships, cargo planes, and mobile repair depots would follow the Shermans wherever they went. Spare track links, engines, transmissions, and even whole turrets could be swapped in the field. A damaged Sherman might be back in action in hours. An entire battalion lost could be replaced on the next convoy. Inside America itself, the machine became a symbol of momentum. Newsreels showed rows of Shermans moving under their own power out of factory gates, rail cars stacked with tanks bound for ports, and convoys of green steel lining highways. Each one was not a marvel. Each one was a promise that the United States could outproduce any enemy, that its fighting men would never run short of tools. For soldiers who would one day ride inside, the tank was a compromise they learned to respect. It was not comfortable. Heat and fumes filled the hull. It was not invulnerable. Enemy guns could and would pierce its armor, but it was there in numbers and it worked. Crews spoke of its engine starting even after days of damp or salt air. Mechanics appreciated that a broken Sherman could be cannibalized and patched with little delay. By the end of 1942, as America turned fully toward the Pacific after halting Japan's early offensives, the outline of the coming fight was clear. The Sherman would not win duels of prestige, but it would be present everywhere American ground forces went, from dusty North Africa to the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal and the coral sands of Tarawa. Its quiet power lay not in being the best, but in being enough. Enough fire to smash a bunker, enough armor to reach the beach, enough simplicity to survive far from home. What no one yet knew was how deeply that pragmatic design would cut into Japanese confidence. Laughter followed its first sightings. Ridicule echoed in bunkers and planning rooms. But war rarely rewards first impressions. The same industrial reasoning that had produced hamburgers and soft drinks for millions of GIs would soon prove equally decisive in steel and gunpowder. On distant islands still to be named in battle reports, men who scoffed at the ungainly M4 would learn what it meant for an army to bring not a tank, but an entire continent's production to the front. The first time Japanese soldiers glimpsed the squat silhouette of the American M4, it was not at the gates of Tokyo or on the black sands of Iwo Jima, but in places so remote that war itself felt improvised. On the beaches and trails of the Philippines in late 1941 and early 1942, Japanese officers, fresh from victories across Asia, studied the strange, high-sided machines captured or disabled by retreating U.S. forces. These early Shermans looked ungainly to men accustomed to the low, spare lines of their own Type 95 and Type 97 tanks. The American hull seemed tall and vulnerable, the armor plates angled but thin enough to invite ridicule. Some officers compared the tank to a farmer's grain silo on tracks. Others laughed at the gasoline engines and jerry-rigged storage welded to the sides. Among themselves, they nicknamed it the matchbox, a rolling target waiting to ignite. Reports followed the first landings and small skirmishes. Intelligence officers measured armor with calipers and shook their heads. Their anti-tank rifles and light field guns seemed more than enough to penetrate the hull at practical ranges. The 75mm gun, when inspected, appeared heavy but crude. They had been told Americans loved comfort and excess. Here was proof they thought of softness, a tall, lumbering machine built for roads, not for jungle. In Manila and beyond, captured American crews left behind wrecks easy to photograph and mock. Japanese newsletters quietly circulated among garrisons describing the Sherman as a gasoline coffin, an ironic name meant to reassure troops that the enemy's armor could be destroyed with a well-placed shell or even a determined infantryman carrying explosives. When the first small detachments of Marines brought Shermans back into action on Macon, Atoll in 1943, the pattern repeated. From behind coral and palm, Japanese defenders watched the strange vehicles churn through sand that would bog lighter machines. Shots rang out. Armor-piercing shells from 37mm guns sparked and slid, leaving scars but rarely penetrations. Yet the impression of vulnerability lingered more strongly than the reality of survival. Reports filed after the fighting described the Shermans as ponderous and awkward, vulnerable to mines and close assault. Commanders still believed suicide charges and satchel explosives could solve any armored threat. Guadalcanal offered another early window. There the Marines fought largely as infantry, but a handful of Shermans were tested in the humid, vine-choked clearings. Japanese officers who glimpsed them saw machines struggling with mud and narrow tracks. They took comfort in the sight of crews stopping to cut trees or repair thrown tracks. To the Japanese eye, this was confirmation. America's tanks were not suited to jungle war. An ambush with artillery or mines could stop them. Disciplined men with grenades could finish the job. Soldiers coined new sardonic phrases for the tall American hulls: walking box, matchlighter, the stove. Around dugouts and fire pits, Laughter softened the worry that the Americans were returning with more than rifles, yet beneath the jokes ran threads of curiosity. Some officers noted the machine's mechanical cleanliness, the robust bogies and wide tracks. They saw how easily the Americans seemed to maintain them even in difficult terrain. They reported on the 75mm concussion when it fired at close range, its high explosive shells strong against wooden bunkers and light field works. Still, doctrine shaped reaction more than observation. Japan's armored force had never been central to its war plan. Infantry and artillery carried the burden. Tanks were adjuncts, not decisive tools. The M4's modest gun and medium armor fit comfortably into assumptions about American materialism and tactical simplicity. Letters home captured the blend of mockery and watchfulness. A young officer on Guadalcanal described to his family the clumsy Western tractors, assuring them that the Emperor's soldiers feared no such machines. In the Philippines, a veteran sergeant wrote that he had seen a tank so tall you could stand under its belly like a carport, laughing at its gasoline smell and visible seams. These impressions hardened into confidence. The enemy had machines, but they were blunt and breakable. American crews, meanwhile, heard rumors of these nicknames and shrugged. They were not unaware of their tank's limits. They joked themselves about the Ronson, light's first strike, a grim nod to gasoline fires. But the U.S. bet was not on invulnerability. It was on continuity. Each tank that broke could be replaced. Each crew supported by an industrial river flowing back to California and Michigan. The Japanese could laugh at what they saw on one beach. They did not yet imagine what would come when hundreds landed at once. Supplied without pause, those first impressions, carried from atoll to jungle, would shape Japanese planning far longer than events justified. The Sherman seemed beatable. Its armor seemed weak. Its height, its gasoline, its boxy seams, all read as invitation. Confidence spread quietly. Engineers improved mines, but did not press for heavier anti-tank guns. Infantry drilled charges and satchel techniques rather than rethink defenses built for lighter threats. The lessons of Macon and Guadalcanal, comforting though they felt, were already misleading. They measured the Sherman as an isolated object, not as the forward edge of an entire industrial strategy. On paper and in memory, it still looked like a joke, a matchbox waiting to burn. But war was not yet finished showing what American scale could do when the laughing stopped. Across the sweep of islands that defined the Pacific, geography itself seemed to take sides. The chain of coral and volcanic ridges stretching from the Solomons to the Marianas did not invite the armored warfare of Europe. Instead of broad roads and open fields, there were coconut groves tangled with vines, hillsides honeycombed with caves, and beaches made of fine coral that turned to soup beneath rain and tide. Japanese planners, long before Pearl Harbor, studied these conditions and shaped their doctrine accordingly. They imagined war fought by infantry who could move where vehicles could not, engineers who could carve paths through jungle, and artillery hidden in bunkers and caves. Tanks were tools of support, not decision. Japan's experience in China had reinforced this logic. On the vast plains around Shanghai or Nanjing, light tanks had proven enough to scatter poorly equipped foes. In rugged interior provinces, tanks had become road-bound escorts, useful but never decisive. Weight was the enemy. Heavy machines bogged quickly and could not cross the light bridges or crude tracks available. When officers prepared for a Pacific war, they assumed even less mobility. Roads were rare, ports primitive. Supply was a greater challenge than battle. Why burden the army with fuel-thirsty monsters when small, agile vehicles could do the work? The weapons that emerged reflected that choice. The Type 95 Hago, with its thin armor and 37mm gun, was built for speed and simplicity. Its cousin, the Type 97 Chiha, mounted a slightly larger gun, but still weighed only half of what the American M4 would bring. Both could be shipped on small freighters and landed from light barges. Both burned little fuel and needed minimal maintenance. They could crawl through tight jungle paths or skirt rice paddies with ease. In doctrine, they were to back infantry assaults, overrun light defenses and exploit openings, not duel enemy armor or breach concrete. Defensive thinking went further still. Japanese engineers learned to treat islands as fortresses. Rather than mobile battles, they planned attrition. Positions sunk deep into coral, firing ports disguised by palms, interconnected tunnels where troops could wait out bombardment and emerge to strike. Bunkers of coconut logs and reinforced concrete resisted small shells and bombs. Anti-tank traps, log barriers, and carefully sited mines were drawn into every plan. If tanks came, they would be strangled by terrain and destroyed by hand when their tracks failed. This environment shaped confidence when American armor appeared. Early Shermans in the Pacific seemed alien and poorly matched. They were tall enough to catch every branch and vine, wide enough to break narrow trails, and heavy enough to sink where a hago might pass. On coral, their weight cracked crust and exposed soft underlayers that swallowed them whole. Marines struggled with bogging and threw tracks on tree roots. Japanese observers took note and found confirmation. Clumsy, they concluded. Powerful perhaps on roads, but no threat in jungle. Supply calculations also reinforced the view. A Sherman burned far more fuel than any Japanese tank and required lubricants and spare parts that could not be found locally. Every gallon of gasoline, every replacement road wheel had to cross the ocean. Japanese officers, schooled in scarcity, believed this alone would limit American use. They imagined only small numbers arriving, quickly stranded without repair or fuel. The Pacific's distance seemed an ally. Even the beaches invited dismissal. Many were rimmed by reefs that trapped landing craft and armor alike. At Tarawa, Japanese officers had watched pre-war exercises and believed coral would stop anything larger than a boat. Heavy steel would founder before reaching the sand. American tanks might exist, but getting them ashore and moving seemed another matter. So when news came that the United States was building tens of thousands of Shermans, the number sounded academic. The islands themselves would neutralize them. Infantry with explosives, artillery sighted to command narrow paths, and terrain's own hostility would be enough. Plans focused instead on fortifying caves and tunnels, sharpening close assault skills, and expanding minefields. Better to make each landing so costly that the enemy might turn away. What the doctrine did not anticipate was adaptation. American engineers studied the same jungle and coral and began to counter it. Breeder tracks, better bridging, amphibious tractors to carry supplies, CBs to cut roads and drain bogs. These would change what the M4 could do. But in 1942 and 1943, that story had not yet unfolded. To Japanese eyes, the Sherman was a poor fit for the Pacific's labyrinth. The light, frugal machines they knew seemed wiser, the pillboxes impregnable. Nature, it was believed, would fight on Japan's side. That belief bred a quiet overconfidence. Defensive works deepened, but remained designed for weapons suited to the 1930s. Anti-tank guns were few, small, and thinly supplied. Ammunition for larger calibers was scarce and hoarded. Confidence lay not in superior steel, but in the conviction that earth and jungle would stop the invader before technology mattered. Watching the first clumsy American armor struggle to move, and even to land, seemed to confirm it. Few foresaw that the same industrial will-forging tanks could also forge the means to move them, that the Pacific itself could be engineered into passageways and coral and swamp turned into tank ground. For the moment, though, Japanese defenders could still smile at the awkward shapes on distant beaches and trust that the terrain would hold. The oceans that once seemed Japan's shield slowly turned into America's road. After Pearl Harbor, the United States confronted geography as its first enemy. The Pacific was a reach of water so wide that planners in Washington once doubted they could push more than small raiding forces beyond Hawaii. Yet the answer, as with so much in the American war effort, emerged not from grand theory, but from the assembly line. Factories that had stamped car doors now hammered out armor plate. Shipyards that had built freighters in months learned to build them in weeks. The key was not one miracle, but many small practical solutions working at scale until distance itself stopped being a barrier. The Liberty ship became a symbol of this quiet conquest. Simple, almost crude, it was designed for one task: to move tonnage fast. Welded rather than riveted, built in modular sections that unskilled labor could join, each Liberty could carry thousands of tons of cargo, including tanks. Where pre-war merchant fleets might spend months on a single hull, new yards in California, Oregon, and along the Gulf Coast could turn one out in little more than a month. Photographs showed rows of ships sliding down greased ways into the sea, flags waving from unfinished decks. Each one meant fuel, food, ammunition, and Shermans could cross the ocean in a steady, unbroken stream. Alongside the ships came a web of logistics no enemy fully understood. The Army Transportation Corps mapped thousands of miles of sea lanes, plotting routes from West Coast ports to Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, and eventually to forward bases carved from jungle and reef. Convoys moved under escort, guided by a discipline learned in the Atlantic. At each stop, cargo was broken down, reassembled, and pushed onward. Tanks left Detroit by rail, rolled into San Francisco, were hoisted by cranes into Liberty holds, and weeks later rumbled down gangways onto coral beaches half a world away. What seemed impossible in 1941, delivering a mechanized army to places without ports or roads, began to look routine. Factories fed this chain with a relentlessness that astonished observers. The Sherman's very ordinariness was its secret. It could be produced in extraordinary numbers. Engines came from aircraft plants that shifted models without pausing, transmissions from auto suppliers, guns from converted locomotive works. Standardized parts meant spares could be boxed, labeled, and shipped with no fear of mismatch. In a single year, American plants built more tanks than Japan would field in the entire war. The question was no longer whether Shermans could reach the Pacific, but how many could be landed at once. Infrastructure followed the ships. Seabees, naval construction battalions, arrived ahead of combat troops to carve docks from coral and scrape airstrips from jungle. Floating cranes and pontoon causeways let tanks drive ashore where no port existed. Engineers built depots under canvas, repair shops from prefabricated steel arches, and fuel farms from endless drums of gasoline. In places once thought unreachable, mechanics soon had pits to change gearboxes, welders to mend track, and depots stacked with road wheels and engines. A Sherman that bogged or broke was no longer a stranded hulk. It was a recoverable asset. This industrial tide changed time itself. In Europe, an army's ability to replace lost vehicles could decide campaigns. In the Pacific, it remade geography. Japan's plan had been to fight a series of delaying actions, to bleed invaders on remote islands until the sea wore them down. But America's supply machine refused exhaustion. Each landing brought not just tanks, but the capacity to support them. Spare barrels, lubricants, rations, even ice machines for crews. What went ashore was not a fragile spear, but a growing, self-sustaining base. Japanese intelligence saw fragments, but rarely the whole. Scouts might note new shipyards or a convoy's size, but the scale was beyond easy calculation. Reports from the Solomons mentioned tanks returning to battle within days of being knocked out, a concept alien to armies trained in scarcity. Captured manuals revealed standardized maintenance procedures, another shock to men accustomed to handmade machines. Even the Liberty ships themselves seemed to appear from nowhere, filling harbors with gray hulls faster than they could be sunk. For American crews, this unseen apparatus was their lifeline. They knew breakdown did not mean abandonment. Parts would come, often faster than expected. Damaged tanks could be towed to beachside workshops, patched and returned. Crews rotated through rest camps where mail, food, and even small comforts reminded them they belonged to an army that did not leave men or machines to rot. Each of these touches came from a production culture that treated distance as just another variable to solve. By 1943, As operations leapt deeper into Japanese-held territory, the psychological shift was profound. Places the enemy considered safe by remoteness, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, suddenly bristled with American hardware weeks after invasion. Roads appeared where jungle had stood. Harbors took shape out of reef and wreck. Behind every Sherman that clanked off a landing craft lay the weight of a continent's steel and fuel and the steady beat of factories that never slept. The Pacific was still wide, but it was no longer a moat. It had become, for the United States, a long supply line that could be built and rebuilt until any shore was within reach. Japan's isolation, once its greatest defense, was slowly undone, not by one decisive battle, but by the quiet, methodical arrival of ships, machines, and men who refused to accept distance as destiny. The lagoon at Betio looked deceptively calm on the November morning when the Marines tried to come ashore. Sunlight flashed on the shallows and on the long coral reef that guarded the island, a pale ridge just beneath the surface. Behind it lay low sand, dotted with palm stumps, and a line of Japanese fortifications built with ruthless precision. For weeks, American intelligence had studied aerial photos and prisoner reports, but no one truly knew how the landing would unfold until the first waves moved in. Among those waves, riding on ungainly landing craft, were the new Sherman M4A2 tanks, the first real attempt to bring armored weight into a Central Pacific assault. Their arrival did not go smoothly. The tide fell short of expectations. Commanders had miscalculated its reach over the reef. Landing craft grounded far from shore, leaving tanks and men exposed to a long slog through waist-deep water under machine gun fire. Crews tried to coax 30-ton vehicles across coral heads, never meant for their weight. Some Shermans slipped off ramps and sank outright, swallowed by sudden drop-offs. Others drowned their diesel engines when waves surged over exhaust stacks. The lagoon became a graveyard of stalled steel, and for Japanese defenders watching from bunkers, the sight confirmed everything they believed about American armor. The tall machines floundered like stranded whales, easy targets for anti-boat guns and mortars. Laughter and shouts echoed along the firing lines as smoke and water marked the Americans' difficulties. Yet not all the tanks failed. A handful found a path and crawled free of the reef, churning toward the beach in slow, unstoppable fashion. When their treads hit firm sand and the 75mm guns swung to bear, the mood changed. Marines pinned down behind seawalls saw shells smash into log and concrete pillboxes that had shrugged off hours of naval bombardment. One bunker after another shuddered, splintered, and collapsed under point-blank fire. The concussion was stunning, far greater than infantry weapons could deliver. Inside the Japanese defenses, men accustomed to surviving bombardment felt the shock of walls giving way. The tanks were fewer than planned, but powerful enough to make their presence known. The Shermans that reached shore worked in desperate partnership with the infantry. Communications were rough. Radios failed in the salt and heat. Marines banged rifle butts on hulls, used hand signals, or simply ran to tanks under fire to point out targets. Gunners learned to aim low, raking firing slits and tearing open embrasures where defenders waited with grenades. Machine guns on the turrets swept parapets clear as Marines pushed forward behind the steel bulkheads. Each yard won came at heavy cost, but wherever a Sherman stood, the advance gained weight and rhythm. Japanese officers watching the fight saw something new. The pre-landing bombardment, though massive, had spared many deep shelters. They had been confident those strongpoints could hold for days. Yet within hours of the Shermans firing at direct range, key positions cracked open. Coconut logs splintered, ventilation pipes burst into flame, and men who had survived the naval guns were buried alive in their own works. One defender later wrote that the tank's arrival felt like iron houses crawling from the sea, unhurt by our small guns. The spectacle forced a recalculation even as the battle raged. Late anti-tank weapons that had promised easy kills proved unreliable. Mines worked when placed perfectly but were few and sometimes misfired in soft coral. Satchel charges required suicidal closeness, and against tanks supporting disciplined infantry, few could approach alive. The defenders' greatest ally, the reef, had taken its toll, but had not been enough to keep armor out. The shock came not just from destruction, but from resilience. Some Shermans took multiple hits and kept firing. Others, bogged, were pulled free by tractors and returned to the line. For American crews, Tarawa was baptism under brutal terms. Inside the cramped hulls, heat and fumes mingled with seawater and blood. Hatches jammed with coral sand. Visibility was almost nil. Yet the tanks that reached the fight gave Marines something intangible. A moving shield in a place where cover was almost non-existent. Even a single operational Sherman could anchor a beachhead and let men gather themselves for the next push. By the end of the battle, Betio was taken at enormous human cost. Many tanks lay wrecked in the lagoon, burned out or half submerged, their crews dead or missing. But among the Japanese survivors, the memory of those few machines that survived the reef and turned their bunkers to rubble lingered deeply. Confidence in natural defenses dimmed. Officers wrote post-action notes urging heavier anti-tank weapons and deeper traps. The gasoline coffins had not died easily enough. Their guns had proved more than adequate for island fortifications once thought impregnable. For the Americans, the lessons were hard and practical. Tide charts would be studied with new rigor. Armor waterproofing and flotation gear would improve. Recovery methods and engineer support would be expanded so fewer machines drowned at the first obstacle. Yet equally important was the realization that once ashore, Shermans could do what days of naval shelling often could not: tear apart the concrete and log skeleton of a defended island. Bunker by bunker, from distances close enough to matter, Tarawa did not look like triumph. It looked like learning at terrible cost. But in that short, bloody experiment, the US proved that armored warfare could have a place in the Pacific. The defenders who had laughed at ungainly shapes in the shallows now knew the sound of a 75mm shell punching through earth and timber at point-blank range. And though the lagoon still held drowned steel, the idea that the ocean alone could keep out America's tanks died there with them. What came out of the lagoon at Tarawa was more than a battered handful of tanks. It was a field lesson written in oil and salt water, one that American crews and engineers would not ignore. The Pacific was not France or North Africa. It was coral that sliced steel, sand that ground through gears, humidity that turned wiring to mush, and enemies who waited close enough to touch. The M4 Sherman could survive, but not as it had been delivered from Midwestern factories. Each campaign became a proving ground for small, stubborn changes that slowly reshaped the tank from a standardized product into something suited for islands no designer had imagined. One of the first problems was protection against the human body itself. Japanese infantry, finding their light anti-tank guns failing, had turned to men with explosives. At night, they crawled across sand or swamp, clutching satchel charges or magnetic mines, hoping to slap them against hatches or engine decks. Crews responded with whatever they could scavenge. Wood planks, coconut logs, scrap steel from wrecked vehicles, anything that might slow a blast, began appearing lashed or welded to hulls. Some units layered sandbags along the glacis plate and turret sides, crude but surprisingly effective at absorbing smaller charges and grenades. Photographs show Shermans draped like improvised fortresses, a long way from the clean factory lines shown in manuals. Heat and climate drove another wave of changes. Crews cut holes, added fans, and rigged canvas covers to shield against sun and rain. Salt water that had drowned engines at Tarawa led to better sealing of hatches and exhausts. Snorkel kits and extended wading stacks became standard so that a tank could wade deeper without choking. Where coral and jungle tangled tracks, mechanics learned to weld extra cleats or carry spare lengths for field repairs. Some battalions experimented with mesh screens over engine decks to stop grenades. Others hung chains and spare treads as skirts to detonate mines early. Inside, comfort remained impossible, but survival improved. Fire extinguishers were mounted within easy reach after crews saw how quickly a Sherman could burn when penetrated. Ammunition storage was shifted lower in the hull and surrounded with protective water jackets in later production runs, a major change spurred by battlefield feedback. What Detroit had built as a general-purpose tank was becoming, piece by piece, a machine hardened by its environment. The psychological effect of these modifications went beyond the crews. Japanese defenders who had once catalogued weaknesses now watched as new waves of Shermans arrived, looking different and harder to kill. The smooth armor they had learned to climb now bristled with sandbags and logs. The decks where a single satchel might once find soft metal were shielded or screened. Even color shifted. Muddy camouflage, palm fronds lashed to turrets, netting that blurred outlines against jungle green. Each small adaptation carried a message. The enemy was learning, and learning fast. At the same time, the tank's performance against fixed defenses grew more decisive. On islands like Kwajalein and later Saipan, the modified Shermans moved with surer footing. Engineers laid causeways and cleared paths, but the tanks themselves had gained resilience. Wider grouses bit into sand. Sealed engines shrugged off surf. Bunkers that had resisted pre-landing bombardments were still being cracked open at point-blank range, but now with tanks better able to reach them in one piece. The Japanese defensive doctrine, hold fast, rely on fixed guns and terrain, began to fray as those fixed points vanished under repeated, accurate 75mm fire. For defenders inside those strong points, the sound of a tank gun was different from ship or plane. Naval shells came and went. They flattened palm groves, but often left buried bunkers intact. Aircraft roared overhead and vanished. But the tank stayed. It approached slowly, impervious to rifle fire, its treads grinding through debris until the black circle of its gun filled an embrasure. Then came the thunder and the collapsing roof. Survivors described an almost intimate terror. Not distant bombardment, but a steel predator at the door. Morale, so tied to the belief that terrain would hold, began to bend. Soldiers whispered that no bunker was safe once the Shermans reached it. Even cave complexes were not secure when tanks backed by engineers sealed openings with direct fire or flame. Where once laughter had greeted the ungainly machines, now there was a watchfulness bordering on dread. Officers demanded closer vigilance. Suicide squads redoubled their drills, but results dwindled. Too many men died before reaching their targets, cut down by tank-mounted machine guns or caught in the open when a shell burst a firing port. For the Americans, these field-borne modifications did more than save lives. They built confidence. Crews who had watched friends drown at Tarawa began to believe their vehicles could master the Pacific. Each campaign's lessons traveled forward. Supply depots stocked with sandbags and welding gear, manuals updated to show how to armor weak points, wading kits shipped with every new tank. Industry listened as well. Production runs quietly incorporated combat feedback, so later Shermans arrived with wet ammunition racks and better sealing already built. In the result by mid-1944 was a subtle but real shift in the balance of initiative. Japan had counted on static defenses and the ocean's vastness to delay and demoralize. Instead, it met an opponent willing to change steel the way it changed tactics, treating every wreck not as defeat but as data. The Sherman was still no wonder weapon. It could still be destroyed and crews died often, but it no longer came blind or brittle. Each hull was a notebook of previous fights, bristling with the hard-won answers of men determined to survive and push forward. And for defenders who had begun the war certain of the tank's weakness, the sight of these evolving machines grinding closer, each campaign was a reminder that the invaders' reach and learning curve were not to be underestimated. In the winter of 1944, the long arc of America's Pacific experiment with armor reached a turning point on the flat coral of Kwajalein. Here, the ocean's barrier seemed even more certain than at Tarawa. The atoll's low islands bristled with bunkers, blockhouses, and trenches dug into crushed coral and coconut log. Japanese troops believed these positions, hardened by months of work and guarded by overlapping fire, would slow any invader until the sea itself reclaimed the assault. Yet the first landings brought something new: Shermans landing in larger numbers, accompanied by engineers and flamethrower teams who had studied the failures of Tarawa and come determined to do better. This time, the tide problem was solved. Charts were checked and rechecked, landing craft crews drilled to cross the reef at the right moment. Armored amphibians ferried supplies and guided paths for heavier vehicles. When the Shermans rolled ashore, they did so more intact, fewer drowned and fewer bogged. White grouses bit into the wet coral. Hatches stayed sealed against salt. Mechanics and engineers had spent weeks refining waterproofing, and wading stacks rose like stovepipes from their decks, keeping engines alive. The first shots from the 75mm guns crashed out across beaches still raked by Japanese fire. The effect on defenses was immediate. At Tarawa, bunkers had endured bombardment only to fall when a few surviving tanks fired at close range. Now that lesson was applied systematically. Infantry moved close behind steel, flamethrowers ready, communication more practiced. When a pillbox showed life, a Sherman rolled forward until its barrel nearly touched the firing port, sent an armor-piercing shell through, and backed off as flames followed. Engineers with satchels and flamethrowers swarmed to finish the work. Whole strongpoints disappeared one by one, the advance creeping but relentless. Japanese officers inside those fortifications felt the change keenly. Their 37mm and 47mm anti-tank guns struck but often failed to stop the tanks. Some shells glanced away or buried themselves without detonation in sandbag and log armor. Mines still killed when perfectly placed, but there were never enough. Men tried close assault, rushing forward with charges under smoke. But Marines now guarded their tanks carefully, rifles and machine guns sweeping likely approach lanes. Every attempt left dead scattered in the open. One officer later wrote that he watched a position collapse as if eaten from the edges by fire and iron, the tanks chewing deeper while infantry hugged their shelter. Saipan, months later, deepened the lesson. The island was far larger, its terrain varied. Cane fields, ridges, towns, and Japanese defenders more numerous. They had strengthened caves, added heavier anti-tank weapons where possible, and prepared counterattacks meant to drive Marines back into the sea. But the Americans came ashore with even more armor and coordination. Shermans landed with bulldozers and flame tanks beside them. Radio nets linked tank commanders and infantry officers. Naval gunfire and close air support could be summoned when needed. Instead of isolated machines improvising, Saipan saw planned armored thrusts through defensive belts. Fighting around Garapan and the hills behind it became a grim showcase. Shermans advanced in pairs or small groups, one covering while another closed to fire. When caves opened up, flamethrower tanks, nicknamed Zippos, moved in to spew burning fuel down tunnels before infantry sealed them with grenades. The psychological weight of these attacks grew unbearable. Men who had survived bombardment and even night fighting now faced fire that crept forward under armor, could not be bombed away, and came day after day. Reports from survivors describe heat, suffocation, and collapse, both physical and mental, as positions thought unassailable fell in sequence. For the Marines, these battles remained bloody. Tanks burned, sometimes with crews trapped inside. Mines and suicide charges claimed lives. Yet there was a growing sense that the method worked. Slow, coordinated advances, tank, infantry, engineers, flame, could crack any fortress given enough time and supplies. Each conquered strongpoint added to the momentum. Once breakthroughs occurred, Shermans exploited them, rumbling into rear trenches and firing point-blank before defenders could shift. Japanese morale faltered in ways commanders could not conceal. The once certain faith that bunkers and caves would hold was shaken. Dispatches to higher headquarters spoke of tanks immune to our light guns and the devastation of flamethrower attack. even the great counterattack on Saipan's night of June 16th, a desperate banzai charge meant to break the invasion, collided with prepared armor and died under concentrated fire. Survivors who had mocked American machines in 1942 now watched them spearhead an unstoppable grind. Behind every tactical success lay the same industrial reach that had solved the ocean problem. Shermans damaged in morning fights returned the next day patched and fueled. Replacement tanks landed as fast as losses mounted. Fuel dumps, spare parts, and entire maintenance crews lived just behind the beach. The defenders saw it too. Where their own tanks were one-shot weapons, America's seemed endless, death replaced by new steel overnight. By the end of Saipan, the shift was clear. America's improvisations had matured into doctrine. What began at Tarawa as a desperate experiment was now a practiced system. The Japanese garrisons learned hard truths. Terrain could delay but not defeat an enemy who adapted. Fortifications alone could not stop a foe with armor, fire, and supply to match. And among the Marines and tankers themselves, a quiet confidence took hold. The Pacific, once thought to belong only to infantry and ships, had found a place for steel. And with each island, that steel came better prepared and more relentless. In the jungles and on the beaches where two empires met, the contest between weapons seemed at first almost mismatched in Japan's favor. The defensive system the Imperial Army had carried into the Pacific was born from campaigns in China and early island sieges. It relied on agility, on small tanks that could be ferried across shallow harbors, and on field guns light enough to move by hand into concealed positions. The core of their anti-armor force remained the 37mm and later the 47mm gun, weapons effective against thin-skinned vehicles but struggling once Allied armor grew heavier. The Type 97 Chiha tank, pride of Japan's mechanized arm, had served well in Manchuria and the Philippines, but weighed little more than 15 tons and carried its own 57mm low-velocity gun originally designed for infantry support, not tank duels. By 1943, even with upgrades, it was modest. Opposite this stood the American M4 with its 75mm main gun. On paper, the difference was simple: a larger caliber, heavier shell, but the reality lay in what that meant for an entrenched defender. The Sherman's gun threw a high-explosive round designed to crack bunkers and clear infantry cover. Japanese strongpoints built of logs and coral had withstood rifle and machine gun fire, and even some naval shelling. At close range, the 75 turned them into dust and splinters. Defenders who had drilled to wait out bombardment found their roofs suddenly caving when the tanks approached and fired from 100 yards or less. Private diaries recovered after battles tell of disbelief. A gunner on Kwajalein described watching a single Sherman roll up to a position that had already endured hours of shelling from ships offshore. "We thought it was safe," he wrote. "We heard the noise of its tracks and laughed because it was alone. Then one shot. The roof broke and smoke came down. Men inside burned or ran." A sergeant on Saipan remembered that the 37mm crews tried to aim for the sides, but found the sandbags and logs too thick, and shells simply bounced or shattered. They tried to hit the tracks. Some success came, but the tanks often kept firing even disabled, holding the breach open until others arrived. Japanese planners had assumed their light tanks could maneuver in ways heavier enemies could not. But the Chiha, when finally meeting Shermans in the field, fared poorly. Its thin armor gave no protection. Its low-velocity gun could not pierce the American hull except at dangerously close range. Encounters quickly turned into slaughter. On Saipan, one company attempted a night counterattack with a dozen Chiha tanks. By dawn, most lay burning or split apart, hit not only by Shermans, but by accompanying bazookas and 105mm howitzers brought in as tank killers. Survivors spoke of iron monsters whose guns glowed in the dark, picking off Japanese vehicles before they could close. Mass industry played its part beyond the tank itself. Each Sherman moved with an escort of firepower. Infantry carrying bazookas and grenades, artillery zeroed in ahead of them, air power overhead when weather allowed. Japanese anti-tank gunners, few and poorly supplied, found themselves overwhelmed not just by the M4's armor, but by the combined system supporting it. A single gun position might knock out one tank, but then naval shells would answer, mortars would fall, and other Shermans would flank. Ammunition was precious. Once expended, no new crates arrived across the American blockade. There was also the psychological drag of watching Americans repair and return their machines. One officer wrote after Saipan that he fired on the same tank 3 times on different days, believing it destroyed, only to see it again with fresh paint and track. In contrast, each Japanese weapon lost was gone forever. Factories at home were already strained. Replacement guns or tanks almost never reached isolated garrisons. Men began hoarding rounds, waiting for a perfect shot that seldom came. For those inside pillboxes, the sensory memory of the 75mm grew haunting. Naval gunfire was impersonal thunder, terrifying but distant. The tank gun was near enough to feel, a concussive punch that shook lungs and teeth. Survivors described a moment when the roof above them lifted slightly with the first impact, then shattered with the next. The tank would back up, fire again, and move on, leaving a smoking cavity. Some wrote that courage faltered not because of numbers, but because the machines would not stop. Every defensive plan assumed delay, but none imagined an enemy who could push steel forward, repair it overnight, and repeat until nothing stood. American crews, for their part, learned to trust their gun. They knew German armor in Europe could outmatch them, but here the 75 was king. It smashed the log and earth positions the Pacific specialized in, and when they needed more, flamethrower variants followed close behind. Infantry loved the tanks for the protection they gave against bunkers that had once stalled advances. The relationship became tight. Hand signals and field radios made combined assault smoother with each island. By mid-1944, the disparity between Japan's pre-war calculus and the battlefield's reality was stark. Light, clever engineering, small tanks, portable guns, pillboxes, had worked in China and early island fights. Against an opponent with an industrial ocean behind him and a medium tank firing high explosive at will, it was increasingly futile. The Sherman was not just heavier. It belonged to a system of supply and support Japan could not match. Each blast through coral and log was a reminder that mass production, once mocked as softness, could be harder than any jungle or cave. And for the defenders crouched in darkness, waiting for the first punch of that 75, the war had begun to feel unwinnable long before surrender became policy. Inside the Sherman, the war was smaller, hotter and more personal than any map or after-action report suggested. Crews lived pressed against one another in steel barely wide enough to stretch an arm. Heat built from the engine and from the Pacific, sunbaking the hull. By midday, the temperature climbed until sweat-soaked clothing and pooled on the steel floor. Diesel fumes and cordite-filled lungs, mixed with the sweet, rancid smell of oil and paint. Each man knew his place by touch, the driver with hands always slick from the levers, the bow gunner hunched in a cramped bubble, the gunner's eye fixed to a swaying periscope, and the commander perched half out of the hatch when fire allowed. They moved slowly, not for lack of will, but because survival demanded it. Every few yards, the driver waited for orders, a crawl forward, a brake, a pivot. A tank that hurried risked mines or unseen holes that could swallow a 30-ton machine in seconds. At Saipan and Guam, engineers cleared lanes with probing poles and explosives, but even marked routes felt uncertain. The crew learned to feel with the tracks. A sudden give underfoot might mean coral turning soft, a mine buried shallow, or nothing at all. Fear rode along in silence. No one needed to name it. Suicide charges haunted every stop. The Japanese infantryman with an explosive pack or magnetic mine could appear from smoke or tall grass. Crews kept hatches clamped down until air grew nearly unbreathable. Periscopes showed only slivers, Vision was a set of keyholes through which death could rush. At night, they strung wire and listened for scraping on the hull, the telltale sound of someone climbing to plant a charge. If a thud came, there was only seconds to act. Throw the engine into gear, rock the tank to dislodge the attacker, or hope a nearby Marine saw and fired first. Even so, the tanks were not impregnable. Many were hit. A mine lifting the hull meant deafening shock, smoke, sometimes fire if fuel lines ruptured. Crews drilled to escape, but knew how narrow the chance was. Friends disappeared in an instant. One moment on the radio, the next only static and black smoke from a wrecked turret. Recovery teams worked hard, but could not always reach a burning tank before ammunition cooked off. Those who survived a hit often bore burns and ringing ears, yet many climbed into another Sherman as soon as one was available, the fight demanding every machine and man. Still, there was trust in the system behind them. A tank damaged but not lost could be towed out under covering fire, mechanics swarming like ants once it reached the beach. Engines swapped, track rebuilt, holes plated over with whatever scrap was at hand. Some crews fought again in the same hull days later, the scars still visible on armor, now darker with soot and salt. Supply lines kept parts flowing. Canvas tents hid full workshops where welders worked by lantern until dawn. That continuity steadied morale in a place where death felt close. Combat inside was a rhythm of stop and blast. The gunner called range, the loader slammed around home, the whole hull convulsed when the 75 fired. Dust and smoke clouded every sight. The commander peered out, wiping goggles and shouting directions. Between shots, they listened for Marines outside, tapping on hulls, waving flags, pointing to bunkers. Sometimes infantry clung to the back deck, riding into fire because the tank's bulk was the safest place to be. Letters home, when they could be written, were plain and spare. Men described the heat, the salt, the smell of burned oil. They did not speak of fear except obliquely, rough going, close work. What they always noted was the grind, foot by foot through trees or cane, bunker after bunker. There was satisfaction when the gun tore apart something that had pinned their own rifleman, but no joy. Only the sense of work finished and the need to move on to the next target. They saw too what their weapons did. After an engagement, the commander might open a hatch and look back. Splintered timber, smoking holes where men had been. Some crews stayed detached. Others felt a weight that crept in later. They were not fighting machines, but people hidden behind those walls, and every direct hit reminded them. Yet the war allowed no pause. Another call, another bunker, another traverse of the turret. What sustained them was partly each other and partly the quiet confidence in the great chain behind them. They knew the ship convoys would not stop. New tanks and parts would come. They knew repair was possible. They knew infantry counted on them and would fight to keep suicide attackers away. Out of that knowledge came a certain calm. Not ease, but acceptance. They were pieces in a slow, grinding advance that refused to break. The Japanese who faced them glimpsed none of this interior world, but some sensed its effect. Prisoners later recalled the strange persistence of American tanks. Hit one day, back the next. Burning wrecks replaced almost instantly. The crew's fear never showed outside, only the steady turning of turrets and the deliberate pace forward. In that rhythm lay the heart of industrial war at human scale, men sweating and choking inside cramped hulls, enduring mines and night. Raids, yet bringing their guns close enough to undo fortresses stone by stone until the jungle itself seemed to yield. By the summer of 1944, what had begun as quiet confidence inside Japanese strongholds was eroding under a weight heavier than shells alone. Men who had trained for years, believing that courage and fortification would hold, now faced a mechanical tide that would not stop. Each new island fight brought the same pattern. Naval guns shook the earth, aircraft swept overhead, and then the Shermans arrived, clattering out of surf and smoke. At first there had been laughter, ungainly shapes stuck in reefs, nicknames whispered about matchboxes and gasoline, coffins, but laughter thins. When the bunkers built to outlast any assault crumble one by one at close range, reports to higher headquarters began to change in tone. Instead of boasting about indestructible defenses, garrison officers wrote of tanks returning again and again, patched and reinforced, firing into embrasures no naval gun had breached. The 37mm guns, still deployed across beaches, proved so weak that crews often abandoned them after the first exchange. Even the newer 47mm pieces, scarce and precious, could do little except at dangerously close range. Ammunition stocks were too small, replacements non-existent. The promise that clever sighting and natural obstacles would neutralize armor had dissolved into blunt fact. The enemy could move steel where it wished and would pay whatever cost required to bring it forward. This realization did not lead to surrender, but to a new, desperate ferocity. Where once anti-tank ambush was a tactical choice, now it became personal sacrifice. Orders circulated instructing men to close with the tanks at any cost. Suicide squads were formed, 2 or 3 soldiers carrying satchel charges or magnetic mines, each expected to die as they tried to cripple a Sherman. Training was brief and grim. How to approach low, how to find the engine deck, how to cling while grenades burst around you. On Saipan and Guam, these teams crept through smoke and cane, often cut down before they reached their targets. Sometimes one made it and the tank vanished in a bloom of fire. The price was always terrible. Whole squads disappeared to stop a single machine. Yet garrisons had no better answer. Without new guns or heavier armor of their own, the only way to meet industrial weight was human flesh. Letters captured after battles spoke of a quiet despair masked as resolve. One young infantryman wrote that he was no longer certain they fought the same war. "The Americans," he said, "build new tanks faster than we bury them." Another described waiting in darkness for an order to rush, and knowing his charge would likely mean nothing beyond a momentary halt. Officers, once confident lecturers on invincible bastions, now urged their men to find honorable death when positions fell. The shift from engineering to sacrifice was swift and ruthless. Morale suffered in subtler ways as well. Men who had endured weeks of bombardment without flinching now felt hunted once tanks entered the fight. Naval guns were terrifying but impersonal. They came and went. Shermans stayed, grinding forward no matter how many were lost. The sound of treads across coral or jungle paths became a private dread, a mechanical heartbeat of inevitability. Survivors of bunker collapses spoke of fear so intense it felt physical. Lungs crushed by concussion, ears ringing from the 75mm impact, then the suffocating smoke and fire that followed. "No place safe," one prisoner said later. "Not even underground." The psychological damage extended beyond the front lines. Messages sent to Japan asked for heavier weapons and more mines, but there were few answers. Industry at home was already strangled. Shipping lanes were failing. Soldiers sensed the imbalance without being told. No relief was coming, no miracle gun would appear. They were left with courage alone, and courage against machines felt like sand against steel. American forces, often unaware of the despair they sowed, noticed changes on the battlefield. Suicide attacks grew more frequent but less organized. Defenders fought with frantic violence instead of disciplined fire. Abandoned guns and positions appeared where once resistance had been calculated. Marines and soldiers described caves taken with fewer shots fired because the occupants fled or self-detonated rather than endure tank fire. Each victory still cost lives, but the sense of an enemy fighting on its own terms was fading. Tank crews, too, felt the change. Where once they had feared swarms of attackers, now they saw single figures dart out, often alone, desperate rather than cunning. It was no less lethal. A single man with explosives could still kill a crew, but it carried a different weight. Some tankers wrote of pity beneath their hardened professionalism, watching men charge, knowing they had been given no other tool. By the time Okinawa loomed, the psychological contest was nearly as decisive as the physical one. The Japanese army still built defenses, still dug deeper, but the old belief that American machines could be neutralized by clever sighting or scarcity had withered. Death remained acceptable, even sought, but it no longer promised victory or delay. It was simply the only coin left to spend. In the space of a year, the mental ground of the Pacific War had shifted. The Sherman, plain and flawed, had become something more potent than armor. It was proof that America could learn and return, that material could answer nature, and that no obstacle stayed unbreached for long. For defenders who once mocked its ungainly frame, the tank now embodied an enemy too vast to stop, a machine and a nation that would grind forward until nothing remained but wreckage and the echoes of men who chose to meet steel with their own bodies. The summer of 1944 carried American armor deeper into the Pacific than many had believed possible. On Guam, the beaches were wide and deceptively gentle, but behind the palms, the island rose in coral ridges and tangled ravines. Japanese troops had spent months shaping these features into a fortress. Caves dug into limestone, spider holes invisible until they flared with fire, and slopes honeycombed with passages for sudden counterattack. When the Marines and soldiers came ashore in July, the sea and sky again opened the battle. Bombardment that rolled for days, aircraft swooping low, but it was the tanks that would have to push beyond the beach and make the devastation final. Shermans landed with less drama than at Tarawa. Tide studies, improved waterproofing, and disciplined sequencing meant most reached solid ground alive. The decks bristled with the now familiar field modifications: sandbags, spare treads, coconut log mantlets, and wire to deter climbers. Drivers felt for firmness in the sand, then rolled forward as engineers flagged safe paths. Infantry formed close knots around them, rifles up, eyes scanning the jungle edge. The work was deliberate. Guam was too big for quick sweeps. It would be taken yard by yard. The coral ridges became the true test. High-explosive shells cracked and split openings, but caves swallowed the blasts and re-emerged alive. Tanks fired into darkness, then waited for flame teams and satchel charges to finish what the gun could not. Sometimes they advanced so close the muzzle almost touched the rock face. A Sherman might hold position for hours, nose toward a single cave mouth, while Marines circled to seal exits. The crews felt exposed, the jungle beyond still alive with snipers and mines, but the slow precision worked. Strong points that had promised weeks of resistance fell in hours once breached. The Japanese fought with a grim resourcefulness. Mines buried at the edges of clearings claimed several tanks. Suicide squads still charged, though many died under machine gun fire before they reached their mark. Type 95 and Type 97 tanks joined night counterattacks, their guns no match, but their crews determined. Yet each assault collided with superior fire and died among burning brush and shattered armor. Survivors later said the sense of inevitability was crushing. Destroy one tank and two more came forward. Their tracks scraping coral, their guns already trained. Peleliu, in September, was smaller but even more forbidding. Its Brogol ridges formed a natural labyrinth. Sharp limestone spines, caves linked by unseen tunnels, and slopes too steep for easy climbing. Japanese defenders under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had abandoned the old tactic of mass banzai charges. They intended instead to bleed the Americans slowly from hidden positions. For the Shermans, it was a place of nightmare geometry. Paths twisted, drops yawned without warning, and every rock might hide a gun. Yet the method refined at Kwajalein and Saipan held. Tanks advanced only with infantry scouts and engineers, marking safe ground. When caves opened with sudden fire, the response was immediate and layered. The Sherman 75 blasted the opening. Flamethrowers followed. Marines sealed what remained with demolition. Some tanks fell victim to mines or Panzerfaust-like charges. Shaped explosive bags pressed to their flanks. But recovery crews risked everything to pull them out or salvage what they could. Even wrecks were stripped for armor to reinforce survivors. Nothing about Peleliu felt easy or clean, but the grinding system worked. Inside those caves, Japanese soldiers wrote final notes describing a war that felt like a slow crush rather than a heroic clash. They heard tanks before they saw them, metal echoing off stone like an approaching earthquake. Machine gun fire and demolition charges followed. Flames roared into tunnels. Resistance meant death. Withdrawal was impossible. One officer recorded that his men began praying for a direct naval shell, anything to end the claustrophobic dread of the tank's advance. American casualties were heavy. Peleliu remains one of the bloodiest amphibious fights of the war. Heat alone killed. Dehydration stalking tank crews sealed into stifling steel for hours. Yet the Sherman's presence allowed infantry to inch forward against defenses otherwise near impenetrable. A single tank could anchor a company's advance, its guns suppressing multiple cave mouths while Marines maneuvered. When one fell, others filled the gap. Slowly the map of Peleliu changed, one ridge taken, then another, until the complex defensive network collapsed under relentless pressure. What emerged from Guam and Peleliu was confirmation more than revelation. The Pacific could swallow men and machines alike, but with adaptation and sheer supply, the Americans could drag steel across it and use it to unmake even the best-prepared fortress. The Japanese had shifted to tactics meant to trade time for blood, hoping each island might cost so dearly that America would falter. Yet time and blood were currencies America seemed able to pay and replenish. Shermans knocked out were replaced. Broken ones returned welded and scarred but serviceable. Marines and army troops, battered yet supported, pressed on behind their armor. For defenders watching their ridges vanish under methodical fire, the psychological turning begun months before deepened into resignation. Courage remained. Men fought and died in place. But the belief that ingenuity and terrain alone could prevail was gone. The enemy had answered the jungle with industry, caves with flame, and distance with ships and repair crews. Guam and Peleliu, one broad and one cruelly small, proved the same truth. An island could be turned inside out if the assault was patient and supplied. From now on, each Japanese garrison faced not just invaders, but a machine of war that learned, returned, and would not stop until every bunker fell silent. The return to the Philippines was more than a campaign. It was the unveiling of scale. In October 1944, when MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte, the American war machine came with him in a way the Pacific had not yet seen. Beaches filled not with a handful of tanks, but with entire battalions. Liberty ships anchored offshore, offloaded M4 Shermans by the score, engines rumbling as cranes swung them into waiting landing craft. Supply vessels followed with fuel, spare parts, ammunition, even prefabricated workshops. For Japanese soldiers dug into palm groves and rice paddies. The sight was stunning, an invasion not of isolated task forces, but of an industrial nation arriving whole. The geography of Leyte was different from the coral atolls. Here were broad plains, rivers, and villages threaded with roads, places where armor could move and fight as it had in other wars. The Japanese had prepared defenses, but not for mass. Their anti-tank weapons remained mostly the 37 and 47 millimeter guns, a few heavier pieces carefully hidden but limited by ammunition and mobility. Light tanks, Type 95s and some improved Chihas, were scattered across the island, thinly armored and lightly gunned. They had been adequate against Chinese infantry years earlier. Now they faced columns of Shermans, advancing behind waves of artillery and airstrikes. When the first armored pushes began beyond the beaches, the imbalance showed immediately. Shermans rolled through villages after preparatory fire left little but shattered bamboo and smoking palm trunks. High-explosive shells burst with devastating precision, blowing apart barricades and trenches. Infantry followed in tight cooperation, radios linking platoons to tank commanders who could adjust fire on the move. Attempts to ambush with small-caliber guns often ended after a single shot. Crews learned to keep moving, present sloped armor, and reply instantly. Japanese gunners once told a well-placed 37mm round could stop a tank, found their shots bouncing or sinking harmlessly into sandbag skirts. Few guns survived long enough to fire twice. Japanese armor fared no better. On Leyte's roads, Chihas tried to contest crossings and were picked off at range. The 75mm on the Sherman, modest compared to Europe's heavy guns, was more than enough here. In some encounters, American crews fired before their opponents even closed to effective distance. Burned-out Japanese tanks littered approaches, their thin plates punched clean through. Survivors often abandoned machines once hit, choosing to fight on foot rather than sit in death traps. Villages turned into strongpoints were systematically undone. Tanks moved up to point-blank range, blasting holes in walls of coconut logs and earth, then reversing for infantry to rush in. At times, the advance slowed to yards per hour as engineers cleared mines and snipers harassed crews, but the weight never lifted. Where one tank fell, another took its place. Where roads failed, bulldozers carved new ones. Recovery units prowled behind the front, dragging crippled Shermans back to improvised depots for repair. Many returned to action within days, blackened scars still visible on their sides. Japanese soldiers began writing home about an enemy that seemed endless. One private described counting 10 tanks destroyed along a road, only to see 20 more arrive the next day. Another wrote of fighting in a village where 3 tanks were set ablaze, only to watch the Americans rebuild their line by afternoon and push on. Ammunition shortages sharpened the despair. Anti-tank shells ran out quickly. Replacements rarely arrived through the tightening naval blockade. Mines became the last reliable defense, but even then, engineers learned to probe and mark lanes, and tanks advanced cautiously, covered by artillery that smashed suspected fields. Morale shifted in visible ways. Before, men had trusted that cunning use of terrain and single brave acts could slow the enemy. Now they faced a force that refused to pause. Suicide charges still came, but often failed. Marines and army infantry guarded their armor with layered fire, and tanks bristled with improvised countermeasures. Some Japanese units tried night attacks, but radar-directed artillery and prepared perimeters broke them apart. The psychological edge once carried by the defender had swung to the attacker. It was the Americans who seemed tireless. For tank crews, Leyte was both triumph and strain. Long road marches under tropical rain and mud-taxed engines and nerves. Mines and hidden guns still claimed lives. Hatches stayed clamped until the air was barely breathable. Yet they felt momentum for the first time. Reports spoke of entire divisions advancing with armored spearheads, of towns falling in hours once tanks joined infantry. The 75mm gun remained adequate. Its high explosive tore through houses and bunkers that would have cost many riflemen's lives to clear alone. As the campaign spread into Luzon and other islands, the pattern repeated and expanded. More ships, more tanks, better roads built overnight by engineers. Airfields sprouted to feed supply and cover advances. Japanese garrisons, isolated and undersupplied, faced not raiders, but an inexhaustible production chain. For many, the war's outcome became clear not from speeches or strategy, but from the daily, grinding reality of steel and fire they could not match. The Philippines taught both sides what industrial war meant when distance no longer protected. The Japanese had built for a quick, decisive struggle. The Americans had built to keep coming, on Leyte's wet roads, and in Luzon's towns. That difference showed in every burned-out Chiha, every bunker cracked by a Sherman shell, every failed counterattack drowned in combined fire. For the defenders, it was a revelation as final as any defeat. No matter how clever the terrain or how brave the charge, there was no stopping an enemy who could deliver massed armor across oceans and keep it fighting day after day. In April 1945, the sea around Okinawa filled with more ships than the Pacific had ever seen. The Americans were closing on Japan's home front, and with them came an arsenal grown heavier and more specialized with each island fight. The Sherman that came ashore here was not quite the same machine that had floundered at Tarawa 2 years before. Many carried the new high-velocity 76mm gun, or the fearsome flamethrower conversion, known among crews as the Zippo. Armor was thickened with welded plates and sandbags. Air filters and snorkels gave engines better life in the humid salt. Behind the assault stood a fleet of repair ships, depots, and fuel tanks strung all the way back to Saipan and Guam. For the men defending Okinawa, it was clear this would be no raid, but an overwhelming storm. The island itself was the most formidable defensive ground yet. General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army had built a labyrinth through the limestone ridges and hills, centered on the Shuri Line. Miles of interlocked caves, pillboxes, and tunnels. Guns were hidden behind steel shutters and camouflage so perfect that bombardments often struck only empty rock. The Japanese plan was deliberate. Avoid wasteful charges, let the enemy come, and kill him in a protracted siege. When the landings began, American infantry moved cautiously, covered by tanks that felt almost like veterans themselves. Crews had learned to fight not just vehicles, but terrain. They advanced with engineers clearing mines, radios alive with calls for supporting fire. The 76mm Shermans fired with sharper crack and longer reach, able to hit gun ports before defenders could strike first. Flamethrower tanks followed the spearheads, belching liquid fire into cave mouths too deep for shells alone. Progress was still slow and costly. The coral hills were jagged and full of death. Each ridge taken revealed another behind it. Rain turned roads into clinging mud. Mines killed men and machines alike. Inside the Shermans, the work was grueling and airless. Heat built until steel walls dripped condensation. Crews advanced feet at a time, scanning for the brief wink of a gun or the sudden grey swirl of an anti-tank rocket. When one tank fell, others moved to shield rescue efforts, spraying machine gun fire while recovery vehicles dragged the wreck back for repair or salvage. Yet for the Japanese soldiers who had trusted the Shuri Line's invincibility, something more than mud and attrition was happening. They watched bunkers that had shrugged off naval bombardment crack open under direct, sustained tank fire. The high-velocity shells punched deeper, and when that failed, flame turned stone into furnace. The Americans did not withdraw after bloody days. They simply adjusted, bringing forward more armor, more fuel, more specialized vehicles. Each time a position collapsed, the next was encircled and treated the same. Underground galleries filled with smoke and heat. Ventilation systems melted. Men who had trained to die at their posts sometimes took their own lives rather than burn. Suicide attacks against the Shermans continued, but with dwindling effect. Infantry screens and close-in machine guns cut down many before they reached their targets. Those who managed to climb onto hulls were met with grenades dropped out of hatches or were shaken loose as drivers lurched and spun. Mines and 47mm guns inflicted losses, but replacements landed steadily. For every tank destroyed, others took its place. The psychological blow was stark. Defenders saw no end to the machine's arrival, no exhaustion in the American system. Among U.S. troops, the sense of methodical inevitability was mixed with the cost. Crews buried friends with each mile gained. Entire platoons were lost to single well-placed guns or sudden cave eruptions. But the system endured. Maintenance ships offshore rebuilt damaged vehicles, and reinforcements filled gaps. Even under constant rain and artillery, armor remained the hammer of the advance. Infantry learned to call tanks forward like siege engines. Each movement measured but certain. For Japanese officers, the breaking of the Shuri Line was the collapse of an idea. This was supposed to be the unbreachable belt that would bleed the Americans dry. Yet one ridge after another fell to the combined power of tanks, artillery, and engineers. Messages to Tokyo grew bleak. There were no reserves to replace losses, no hope of new weapons to match the Americans' reach. Men fought on because surrender was forbidden, not because they believed victory possible. By June, the shattered remnants of the defense pulled back or died where they stood. The Shermans, blackened and scarred but functional, rolled into ground once thought impregnable. The surviving crews scarcely celebrated. The cost in blood was too fresh. But they understood what had happened. The Pacific's harshest test of armored war had been passed not by brilliance alone, but by relentless adaptation and the ability to keep machines fighting when any other force might have stopped. Okinawa taught a final lesson that echoed beyond the island. Industrial strength married to learning could erode even the most determined resistance. The Japanese had tried every answer: concealment, terrain, suicide bravery, and found none lasting. The Sherman, once mocked, had become emblem of inevitability, a tool of pressure applied until even the deepest caves gave way. For the soldiers who survived inside those tanks, and for the defenders who faced them, Okinawa marked the war's last grim turning. The distance from Tarawa's floundering experiment to this disciplined, crushing engine of combined arms was measured in thousands of dead, but also in a strategic truth now undeniable. Japan's barriers had finally met an enemy who could adapt faster than they could fortify, and who would come back every time with more steel, more fire, and no thought of turning back. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the men who had survived the long retreat from the Pacific Islands returned home to a homeland hollowed by fire and defeat. They carried few weapons and fewer illusions. Among them were soldiers who had once laughed as ungainly American tanks drowned on reefs or floundered in jungle mud. In barracks and hospitals, on trains winding back to shattered towns, they spoke quietly about how their understanding of war had been overturned. The laughter, one veteran recalled, died somewhere between Tarawa and Saipan, replaced first by unease and finally by a cold respect for a force they could not match. Many of these men had been taught that war could be won by spirit, ingenuity, and careful preparation. They had spent months digging bunkers they believed would survive any bombardment, carving cave systems in limestone, rehearsing ambushes and suicide charges. Their officers had promised that the sea was an ally, that distance and difficult terrain would grind down an enemy unused to hardship. Yet by the time they faced the Shermans again at Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa, those assurances had become stories told to keep men fighting in the dark. The Americans had not just brought tanks, they had brought a system that learned faster than the defenders could adapt. In post-war debriefings and memoirs, Japanese officers often dwelled on the industrial scale behind each engagement. A company might fight for days to stop a handful of tanks, lose dozens of men, and believe the balance restored, only to watch replacements land within hours. It was like fighting the tide, one captain wrote. You could kill a wave, but the sea remained. Where Japanese garrisons lived on strict rationing and often had to improvise mines or shells from salvaged scrap, the Americans seemed inexhaustible. Fuel never ran out. Parts arrived. Repair teams made wrecks live again. The idea that a tank once destroyed was gone proved untrue. Scarred Shermans reappeared, patched and ready, their crews grim but determined. There was also grudging admiration for how Americans combined arms. Survivors remembered that no tank fought alone. Infantry screened its flanks, engineers cleared mines, artillery and naval guns reached ahead, and aircraft struck beyond sight. It was not brilliance in a single weapon, but the weaving together of many that slowly stripped away every advantage. Their tank was never just a tank, an artillery officer explained years later. It was ships, planes, radios, workshops, and men moving as one. This understanding came too late for those who had planned static, isolated defenses. For individual soldiers, the personal memories were sharp and unadorned. They spoke of hearing treads in the night, of feeling bunkers shake under 75 or 76 millimeter hits, of smoke turning caves into ovens. Some recalled the moment awe replaced contempt, a first shot that breached a supposedly invulnerable wall, a Sherman shrugging off direct hits and pushing forward anyway. Others remembered the exhaustion of counterattacks, the suicidal rushes that ended under machine gun fire, the hopelessness of clinging to armor for a few seconds before flames or bullets found them. "We thought they would fear death," one survivor said. But they feared nothing more than wasting time. At home after surrender, Veterans told younger men that Japan had not been defeated by one weapon, but by a kind of war the nation had never prepared to fight, one of endless production, repair, and adaptation. Factories in America had built not just machines, but the ability to change them in response to every lesson. Each island taught the enemy how to come back stronger. Tarawa's drowned tanks became Kwajalein's wading Shermans. Saipan's exposed decks became Okinawa's fire-spewing monsters. Against that cycle, bravery alone had been insufficient. The Sherman itself, so ordinary to its crews, became a symbol in Japanese memory. Not elegant, not invulnerable, but present, always present. Its squat turret and rattling tracks stood for the enemy's reach across the ocean and the failure of Japan's isolation to keep war distant. Veterans described dreams of its engine's growl, of the way it appeared even after seeming destroyed, of the psychological weight it brought more than the shell bursts alone. Some said that the first time they saw one land and survive changed their belief in the war's winnability. It meant America could project steel anywhere. These reflections did not always come with bitterness. Some survivors expressed respect for the American soldier, and especially the tank crews, who faced heat, mines, and suicide attacks, yet returned again and again. Others took the lesson as warning. Never underestimate an opponent's capacity to learn, and never plan a war that depends on the enemy failing to adapt. The post-war Japanese self-defense forces studied American combined arms and logistics carefully. The humiliation of those island battles became a foundation for modern doctrine. In the ruins of cities and the slow rebuilding of a new Japan, the memory of unstoppable American industry remained vivid. It was not just about weapons, but about a system that could feed, fuel, and fix itself faster than destruction could keep up. For men who had dug and died believing courage could balance odds, the truth was painful but undeniable. War had proven to be more than fighting. It was production, transport, and the cold math of replacement. The Sherman, once the subject of easy jokes, came to represent that lesson in steel and fire. When peace returned, former enemies sometimes met. American veterans found Japanese counterparts who spoke with quiet frankness. They asked about the tank, about its guns and its crews, about how it felt to ride out naval shelling and push into darkness. And the Japanese answered honestly: fear, respect, resignation. The machine itself was simple, but behind it stood a nation's capacity to sustain and improve, a force no bunker, no reef, and no courage could finally stop. When the last Shermans left the Pacific beaches, many were little more than scorched hulks. Crews who had lived inside their cramped hulls did not speak of invincibility. They remembered heat, mines, sudden fire from unseen guns. Yet in the years that followed, a quiet rethinking began. What had been dismissed by friend and foe alike as a stopgap, a medium tank built to be good enough, had outlived mockery. Its presence had changed the way two nations saw war, and how one of them, defeated, would think about defense and industry for decades to come. American veterans were among the first to take stock. They knew the Sherman's flaws better than anyone. Thin armor compared to Europe's heavy German panzers. Gasoline or diesel engines that could still ignite. A gun that struggled against modern steel but excelled at smashing bunkers. In the Pacific, those limitations mattered less than a different set of virtues. Reliability, ease of repair, and a production system that could replace losses almost overnight. Mechanics could strip and rebuild a powertrain under canvas. Spare tracks and bogie wheels arrived in endless crates. Factories adapted quickly, sending wet ammunition racks and improved seals after each campaign revealed vulnerabilities. The tank's simplicity became its real armor. For Japanese officers and engineers rebuilding their nation under occupation, the lesson was sobering, but also instructive. They had gone to war with machines tailored to narrow circumstances, light, mobile, and handmade in small runs. That approach faltered against an adversary willing to mass-produce something merely adequate but adaptable. Post-war defense thinkers, forced to renounce offensive arms but still studying what had gone wrong, fixated on logistics and interoperability. If Japan ever needed to defend itself again, it would have to emphasize support networks, spare parts, and training cycles as much as the frontline weapon. In industry, the experience left deeper marks. Factories that had once turned out small batches of bespoke tanks or guns began studying American assembly methods. Engineers who had watched Shermans reappear days after destruction understood that endurance could be engineered not only into the machine, but into the supply chain. These ideas, divorced from war but applied to cars, electronics, and heavy equipment, helped shape Japan's post-war economic rise. Efficiency, modular design, and a culture of continuous improvement, concepts sharpened by defeat, became hallmarks of a manufacturing revival that astonished the world within a generation. For military historians, the Sherman's Pacific story complicated easy judgments. In Europe, it had been measured against tigers and panthers and found wanting. In the islands, it fought a different war and proved fit for purpose. It was never a duelist tank, but a campaigner's, able to cross oceans, fight in mud and jungle, and serve as a moving bunker where no other cover existed. Combined with engineers, infantry, and overwhelming shipping, it gave the United States a flexible tool for an unfamiliar theater. Its record forced later planners to consider context before declaring a weapon good or bad. Among Japanese veterans, memory softened but did not fade. In interviews decades later, many said the Sherman taught them that technological superiority on paper meant little without the capacity to sustain it. They remembered bunkers collapsing under point-blank fire, caves turned furnace by flame tanks, and the unsettling speed with which the enemy learned. Some admitted that their own overconfidence in static defense and artisanal production left them vulnerable. When Japan began building its post-war ground self-defense force, designers studied American armor principles closely: ease of maintenance, integration with infantry, and above all, the supply web that kept machines running. There was also a cultural reckoning. Before and during the war, improvisation and heroic sacrifice were exalted. After, endurance and system building earned new respect. The image of the Sherman rolling forward, patched and serviceable rather than perfect, lingered as a kind of parable. Victory had belonged not to the flawless, but to the resilient. Factories that once turned out fragile light tanks shifted to making practical, reliable vehicles for peace. Managers and engineers pursued Kaizen, incremental, endless improvement, echoing the wartime American habit of field-driven change. For Americans, the Pacific chapters of the Sherman story entered doctrine quietly. Amphibious armor, repair logistics, and close tank infantry cooperation became assumed knowledge. Marine manuals preserved lessons born in coral and fire: how to waterproof a hull, how to coordinate with flamethrower teams, how to feed a tank force across oceans. Those insights influenced Cold War planning, where Pacific defense and rapid deployment demanded the same relentless attention to supply and modification. In public memory, the Sherman never became glamorous. It lacked the mythic silhouette of the Tiger or the cutting-edge aura of later main battle tanks. Yet among the men who fought with or against it, the machine gained a different respect. It was enough. And being enough everywhere and all the time turned out to matter more than perfection. Its adaptability showed that war at vast distance rewards not the exotic, but the maintainable and the plentiful. On the other side of the ocean, Japan built a new identity in part from that recognition. When its post-war industry roared to life, when its cars and electronics began to flood global markets, some of the quiet inspiration traced back to a hard lesson learned in jungles and caves. Simple done right can overwhelm complex done sparingly. Modern Japanese defense planners, limited in what they can field, still emphasize readiness, supply, and the ability to keep forces functioning under stress. Thus, the Sherman's legacy was not just steel left to rust on forgotten beaches. It was a kind of template, a reminder that machines succeed when tied to a living system that can learn and replenish. In the Pacific, that system helped end a war. In peacetime, its echo shaped how former enemies rebuilt and redefined strength. The tank, once mocked as a gasoline coffin, became, by its stubborn adequacy, a teacher, to its own crews about survival, and to a defeated nation about the cost and the craft of enduring.